someone you love is gone. And weeks later, your chest still physically aches. Not a metaphor. An actual physical dull pressure sitting right behind your sternum. Why would losing someone cause a sensation in your body that feels almost identical to a heart attack? The answer is not really about you. It is about something your brain has been doing since long before you were born. Something built into the wiring of every mammal that has ever formed a bond worth protecting. Grief is not a malfunction. It is a receipt. It is proof that an attachment existed, and your brain is now struggling to update a map that no longer matches the world. Here is where it starts. Psychiatrist John Bowlby spent much of his career studying what happens when infants are separated from their caregivers. He noticed something odd. The distress a child showed after separation followed a strikingly consistent pattern. First came protest, loud crying, searching, an almost frantic attempt to bring the missing person back. Then came despair, a collapse into stillness and sorrow. Bowlby argued that this sequence was not learned. It was built in, the same way a heartbeat is built in, because throughout nearly all of human history, separation from a caregiver meant real danger. A child left alone on the savannah did not simply feel sad. That child was likely to die. So evolution did something clever. It welded grief directly onto the same circuitry responsible for survival itself. Losing an attachment figure was treated by the ancient brain as an emergency on par with starvation or predation, because for most of human history, it effectively was one. Does this explain why grief in adulthood still feels like an emergency, even when you know, rationally, that you will survive the loss? It does. Your prefrontal cortex, the calm, reasoning part of your brain, understands perfectly well that you will keep breathing, keep eating, keep going to work. But the older, faster systems underneath that reasoning brain do not process the loss as information. They process it as danger. And danger produces a very specific physiological signature: elevated cortisol, a racing heart, disrupted sleep, a loss of appetite. All of the symptoms people describe during grief are, quite literally, your body's ancient alarm system misfiring in response to a threat it cannot fix by fighting or fleeing. This mismatch becomes even clearer once you look at what actually happens inside your chest during acute grief. Doctors have long documented a condition now known as broken heart syndrome, formerly called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. In the days following the sudden loss of a loved one, a flood of stress hormones can temporarily stun the heart muscle itself, causing chest pain, shortness of breath, and symptoms that look almost identical to a real heart attack on a hospital monitor. The condition is rare, but it is real, and it is a striking illustration of just how far the reach of grief extends. Losing someone does not just affect your mood. It can physically reshape the rhythm of the organ keeping you alive. Why would a species evolve a system this costly? Wouldn't it make more sense from a purely practical standpoint for grief to simply switch off once someone was gone, sparing the body all this wear and tear? The honest answer is that grief was never designed as an experience to be endured for its own sake. It is closer to a side effect, an unavoidable cost of a much more valuable feature: the capacity to bond deeply in the first place. Anthropologists studying early human groups have long argued that our ancestors survived largely because they cooperated, formed alliances, raised each other's children, and protected one another from threats no single person could face alone. That kind of cooperation only works if the bonds between people are strong enough to be trusted completely. And bonds strong enough to be trusted completely will always hurt when they are severed. You cannot have one without risking the other. Psychologist George Bonanno, who has spent decades studying how people actually respond to loss, found something that surprises most people when they first hear it. The popular idea that grief must move through a fixed, universal set of stages turns out not to hold up well under careful observation. In Bonanno's research, most people, given time and support, show a pattern closer to resilience than collapse. Sorrow comes in waves rather than a straight, uniform descent, and for many people, those waves gradually become less frequent and less intense over time, without any single moment marking a clean, permanent recovery. Consider why certain moments during grief hit so much harder than others, seemingly at random, reaching for the phone to share good news before catching yourself, setting the table for one extra place out of pure habit, hearing a song that used to play in the car. None of these moments are really about the big, obvious fact of the loss. They are about a single small prediction failing to match reality all over again. Your brain built its entire model of daily life around this person's presence, and that model does not update all at once. It updates in fragments, in ambushes, at the exact moments you least expect it. Humans share much of this same underlying chemistry. This is part of why grief so often feels less like sadness in the ordinary sense and more like withdrawal, in almost the same sense used to describe recovery from addiction. The comparison is not just poetic. Some researchers studying grief and attachment have pointed out genuine overlaps between the neural reward pathways disrupted by losing a loved one and the pathways disrupted during substance withdrawal. Your brain built a dependency on this person's presence in the most literal neurochemical sense of that word, over months and years of contact. Removing that presence suddenly does not simply remove a source of comfort. It creates a biochemical gap that the rest of your nervous system spends a long time learning to live around. This raises an interesting question about why humans grieve so much longer and so much more elaborately than nearly any other species on Earth. Elephants have been observed lingering near the bones of dead herd members, touching them gently with their trunks, sometimes returning to the same spot repeatedly over months. Chimpanzees have been seen carrying the bodies of dead infants for days. But no other species builds funerals. No other species writes elegies, carves headstones, or returns to a grave every year on the same date for the rest of a lifetime. Why might that be? Because human grief is entangled with something almost no other species has in the same way: a fully developed capacity for language and memory across time. You do not just miss the physical presence of someone, you miss an entire narrative, a shared history stretching backward, and a shared future that will now never happen. Anthropologists studying grief rituals across vastly different cultures, from public wailing ceremonies to quiet solitary mourning, have found remarkable variation in outward expression but a consistent underlying purpose. Rituals give the community a structured way to acknowledge that a bond has been permanently altered, while surrounding the grieving person with exactly the kind of social contact their nervous system most needs during the process. That last point matters more than it might seem. Just as the earlier research on social bonding shows that companionship measurably calms an activated nervous system, the presence of other people during grief appears to do something similar, cushioning what would otherwise be a much harsher biological process. This may be part of why isolated grief experienced entirely alone without community or ritual, tends to be reported as more prolonged and more difficult. The ancient system driving your sorrow was never built to be endured solo. It was built inside a species that survived specifically because no one ever really grieved or hunted or raised children entirely alone. So what does all of this add up to? Grief is not evidence that something has gone wrong inside you. It is evidence that something went right for a very long time beforehand. The ache in your chest, the disrupted sleep, the strange ambushes of sorrow triggered by an empty chair or a familiar song. All of it is the cost of a system that evolved specifically to make deep attachment possible in a species that could not have survived without it. Your ancestors did not evolve grief because nature wanted them to suffer. They evolved grief because the alternative, an inability to form bonds strong enough to be worth mourning, would have made the species far less likely to survive at all. Every capacity for connection carries within it an equal capacity for loss. You cannot have the safety of a herd without eventually feeling the absence of a herd member. You cannot have the warmth of an irreplaceable bond without eventually facing what happens when it becomes irreplaceable in the most literal, permanent sense. So the next time grief catches you off guard, in a quiet, ordinary moment you did not see coming, know what you are actually feeling. You are not broken. You are carrying the same ancient, expensive, remarkable machinery that allowed your ancestors to love each other fiercely enough to build families, communities, and civilizations in the first place. The ache is not the absence of love. The ache is what love looks like after the person it was built around is gone, still running, still faithful, still doing exactly what it evolved to do.